Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be about Torath Mosheh and proven facts. Now this video I'm making due to a conversation, or I guess you could say a written discussion I was having with someone, where I've used this graphic in the past, and I've also used it from a quote from the Kuzari concerning something that it mentions about the Torah cannot contradict what is seen and proven to be true. Now, the question would be, well, what exactly does that mean? Okay, well, it's important to stress the idea of what is seen and proven to be true, not what is thought to be true, and not what is philosophically considered to be true, but what is seen and proven to be true. And what essentially the Kuzari is talking about here when it says Chalila ele shetovo haTorah b'ma sheyidache ra'oyom o mofet ach tovo b'niflaot b'shanot המנהגים לברת דבורים או להפך דבר אל דבר אחר, להורות על חוכמת בורא העולם ויכולתו לעשות מה שחופץ בעת שהחפוץ. So essentially what this is getting at is that the Torah is not given in order to try to say, ha, gotcha, what you thought was true is not even remotely considered to be true, and it can't possibly be true. It'd be like saying, for example, most human beings look up and see the sun. Now we may define it as something different, we may consider its job to be something different, but we all look up and see it. So the Torah is not given to say, haha, there's really no sun. Let me just peel away this is all fake, just to kind of throw you off. And that's the thing that is there. So if there's something mentioned in the Torah, for example, if Hashem gave mitzvot, or if there's any historical information that is said to have actually happened in reality and not, for example, be a midrash or be something that is, for an element of storytelling that is not said to be a proven factual historical event. The Torah is not here to try to fool us into thinking that something happened that didn't happen. And I'll get into that, what that means in a little bit more detail. So one element of this is what I'll consider to be not really, a Western issue, I think, more than anything else. And it's dealing with the issue of, what I would say is maybe science versus religion, or even like reason versus religion. And that's this idea that you have two different sides, a religious side, and a scientific side, who are kind of interlocked in this battle of ideas, to kind of say, okay, well, as this graphic says here, science, even when you have tons of evidence, doubt what you see, versus religion, as it says, even without a single piece of evidence, believe what you can't see. Now, this is one of the reasons I say that I don't go by the Western term religion, because generally speaking, when you use that term, it means something to people in the Western world. In the Hebrew language, for example, there's no real word that is religion the way that it means in English. As an example, in modern Hebrew, again, modern Hebrew, the word dat is used to kind of say religion as a translation. But if you look at ancient Hebrew, the word dat doesn't mean religion. It means like a statute or a law. So for example, in modern Hebrew, people say, okay, well, someone who does mitzvot or keeps the Torah, they're dati. Meaning, if you will, in English, people would say, okay, that means religious. But in reality, if you look at like ancient Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, calling someone dati means they follow the law. So it'd be like saying, okay, well, he drives like according to the way the speed limit says. He's dati. Meaning he follows the law, he follows the statutes that exist in the land. He doesn't steal. Well, he's following the law. That would be the same kind of connotation. And that's why I say I don't really personally use the word religion, especially when I'm speaking in English, because it generally gives into this concept that is mentioned in the second part of the slide, what you see here of even without a single piece of evidence, believe what you can't see. And that's something I don't hold by. And at the same time, the part on the second part on the left side about science is not correct either, but it's kind of contrasting these two concepts that exist on either side of the line. So now I'm going to deal with some Torah-based perspectives on facts. Now, one of the things that I was criticized about on some of the videos when I put this word truth there in Hebrews Hamet, in the use of that. Now, one of the things I think that's important to note is the word truth does exist as a word in most languages. So there are certain things that are usually considered truth connected with facts, meaning that there are things that you can kind of wade through and say there are facts. Now, one of the things I'd like to present is, you can read this for yourself here, and I'll just kind of talk about it, is one of the things the Rambam mentions, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, in his book called the Moreh Nevuchim. And basically, this was a book to kind of detail ideas to people who are wanting to know more. People who had questions. It's like saying if someone's kind of confused about something, he deals with some of the deeper issues. Now, again, that doesn't mean that person has to take every word he says as fact. It's more like saying, well, here's a discussion, here's an investigation that we can go through together. And the main point of his book was to kind of prepare a student that he had for learning the book of Yehezkel, or in English you call it Ezekiel, because of the ideas that are presented in Ezekiel can be confusing to people if they don't have the right background. So he mentions what you see here, that through the intellect man distinguishes between the true and the false. The right and the wrong are terms employed in the science of apparent truths, not in that they are necessary, not in that of necessary truths. Similarly, our language expresses the idea of true and false by the terms emet, and this is Hebrew, and sheker, of the apparent truths of the right and the wrong, by tov and ra. Thus, it is a function of the intellect to discriminate between the true and the false, in a distinction which is applicable to all objects of intellectual perception. Now, again, it's important to note the Rambam did not write in English. I'm simply, pulling out an English translation for the sake of time. He wrote in Judeo-Arabic, which, translation-wise doesn't always translate very well into English. The Hebrew translations are a lot better, especially depending on who you get them from. But this is something that's important to note, that there is a distinction that's made between, the terms emet and sheker, tov vera, and that these, concepts of, apparent truths versus right and wrong, things like that exist in the language of the Torah, as well as the writings which use the Torah as the basis for those writings. Further to this point, Rabbi Saad Yagon, in his book Imunoth V'Deot, mentions the following. He says, a knowledge, da'at, has two sides, truth and falsehood. The knowledge of truth, emet, is known as a matter that is from the many is the many, the few is the few, the black is black, white is white, available, established is available, established, and lacking is lacking. He says, falsehood, sheker, is known as a matter that is from the many or few, the few or many, black is white, white is black, available, established is lacking, and lacking is available, established. So what this means is that there are ways to determine whether something has some basis behind it in the element of facts, truth, for example. So if something completely contradicts what is known to be true, as an example, it'd be like saying, an example I'm about to get into. Let's say someone says it's a country called Egypt, and then you go and look, there's no such country. It doesn't exist. The land mass isn't there. There's nobody ever called a country that. You look through and don't find any archaeological evidence for the name of such a place at all. That would be, for the moment, this is an apparent truth that this is not the case. What you've said is the opposite of the reality. Now if someone says, okay, well, look, there was a place called Egypt. It was once here. This happened to it. But I don't really want to believe that it ever existed in this way. Well, that's something different. Where, for example, falsehood is something where, as we said before, it's the opposite of what, seems to be the reality. So, for example, someone says, well, there's a sun, that, the earth goes around the sun. Someone says, I look up in the sky, there's nothing there. It's literally dark. There's nothing ever there. Never has been there. Nobody's ever said that. There are apparent truths every day. Someone could say, okay, where I work, for example, I once had a conversation with someone who said, well, there's no real truth. And I said, okay, well, do you work here right now? And he's like, oh, well, that's not a truth either. I said, okay, if it's not true, then how about this? Go to the employer, tell them you don't want to get paid for 2 months. And then when the bill collectors come, tell them that there's no apparent truth, and then see what happens then. Now, this is further brought up in Echa Rabbah, where it deals with the idea of, is there, like wisdom, is there chokmah in Hebrew, would be said, amongst the non-Jewish nations? And they answer, yes, there is. There's wisdom amongst the non-Jewish nations. There's no claim in the Torah that only Jews know everything. That there's no other nation that knows anything about anything. But when it comes to the Torah, we don't believe the other nations have it, that only the Jewish people have it, because it's something that was given to us and something that we've kind of debated, gone over and examined. And, so it's like saying, when it comes to Torah, the Jewish nation of people who keep Torah are the experts, especially when you look through ancient Jewish societies who maintained the Torah and passed on the Torah as we have it today. But the nations do have knowledge. So if I need medical knowledge, I don't have to say, well, because this person's not Jewish, I can't go to them as a doctor. No, if he's a doctor and he has knowledge of what he's talking about, and of course I have to vet any person I'm using as a doctor. I don't have to say, okay, well, he's not Jewish, I can't go to him. No, if he's a doctor and he knows what he's talking about, I can go to him. I may take his information and kind of go over it, verify it, maybe get a second opinion. But that doesn't mean I have to go to someone specifically who's Jewish to get like medical advice, scientific advice, scientific information. Science doesn't come only from Jewish people. It comes from anybody in the world who is delving into the areas of science. You have to verify it. You have to vet it. You have to research it. You have to go back over it over and over again. But isn't a situation where there's no such thing as knowledge that exists anywhere. So that's the important part of what I'm about to get into now. So I want to take an example that was thrown at me, where a person took the quote I showed in the very beginning of this video about the fact that the Torah is not here to contradict what is seen and proven to be true. And someone would say, well, then you don't believe in the Exodus. And I was kind of like, okay, well, first of all, what are you talking about? And the person, was trying to say, okay, well, most scholars say that the Exodus didn't happen. Therefore, you're saying that because of that, it must not have happened and you don't believe in it. And the problem is the following. In determining any matter like this, the first step is, well, what is the Torah? What do Torah-based sources state about the whole thing? And it isn't just what is written in the Torah. What does the oral Torah say? What do generations after generations of Jews say about the whole thing? Because the only way to know what is being talked about, especially if you're comparing it to what supposedly modern scholarship or research says about something, you'd have to know first of all what is the Jewish claim. This means that you would have to scour through loads of Jewish information to find every position that exists. So for example, let's say that there's a Jewish position that says this one particular paro, one particular pharaoh was the one of the Exodus, for example. In Hebrew, you could even say, well, it's not even called an Exodus, it's called Yetziat Mitzrayim. So you'd have to find out what does all this mean. You'd have to find out, well, what characteristics do any source say about this particular person who was leading Egypt at the time, as an example. Because, for example, there's people who say that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus, but the Torah never says that. The Torah never says, it even gives a name of any of the pharaohs at all. It isn't until later in the Tanakh that the first pharaoh is given an actual name. Of the pharaoh of that time, for example, of a later time. But the previous ones, for example, are not named. And one of the reasons that's given in some cases because the fact that the pharaohs were known to be elements of Avodah Zarah. So of course you're not going to name a specific element of Avodah Zarah in that way. So the other issue is that okay, let's say I find let's say 30 different Jewish sources, from different Jewish communities that describe all these events. Well, I have to take all of those and collect them together and then lay them out and say, okay, well, let me find out if any of this makes sense and let me find if any of this has a connection to something historical. So then, when I look at things, for example, going back to the original point, you have to review historical and archaeological evidence, from all sides. Um, this is one of the things I notice with these kind of debates that people will only look at it from one side and say, okay, I've already figured it out. Either I'm against or for, only because of one side and not because I've reviewed both sides. So as an example, first of all, if I want to deal with what is an historical event, if something took place outside of the religious concept of what took place, but historically, it had to have historically happened. If there was a Yetziat Mitzrayim, if there was an Exodus, it's an historical event, not simply just here's a religious idea. So we have to define what's a historical research. How do we determine what is historical and what happened in history? So this is one definition that I found, for example, amongst others. This isn't the only one that you could look at and say, okay, well, this is what we can define as historical research, a process of collecting, interpreting data about past events or ideas in order to find how they affected the present events and ideas. Now, one of the problems you get into with historical research is who do you consider a valid researcher of history? So, for example, in the modern sense, for example, most of the time when people deal with historical research, they usually go to westernized sources, meaning American or European. But for example, there was a historian in Senegal who had claimed that there was a lot of racism against his work because of the fact that he wasn't from the Western concept. He was presenting ideas of historical, based on his own historical research, that people were immediately saying, okay, we don't agree with you. And it wasn't because they went through his information and picked it apart bit by bit, but it was simply because you come from a place that we don't agree with. You're not a part of the collective that we consider to be historical researchers. Therefore, you're out of the picture. You're not even in the game. The next issue is archaeology. Because history without archaeology is not a complete picture. Archaeology is the study of the human past using material remains. Now, again, one of the problems here is, okay, well, how do you find material remains that may have been underground for thousands of years? How do you know they haven't broken down? The other issue is that when you're looking through archaeology and digging up things, a lot of times it's like finding a needle in a haystack. There's no guarantee you're going to find anything at all, and there's no guarantee you're going to find it in your generation. Now delving into this idea of the two sides. So for example, this side is well known that there, for example, is this idea that there's no direct evidence of any of the people of or Exodus events in the non-biblical ancient text or archaeological remains. And this has led most scholars to omit the Exodus events from the comprehensive histories of Israel. Okay, that's fair enough. And you can pretty much find these claims like all over the place. It's a pretty well-known claim, a group of claims. But in order to really say you've researched something, you have to accept the other side. Now, before I present the other side, often when you present this, there are people who, for example, when I presented some of the stuff I'm about to present now, there's a person who put like a laugh comment on there, and they never provided any evidence to the, why each point brought up in all these other things is incorrect. And as far as I'm concerned, even if you say, okay, well, I don't agree with this person, it still exists. So it means that something hasn't been proven. So this point in particular hasn't been proven to be the fact. It's only something that's believed to be the fact by certain people. So let's look at the other side to show that it isn't a proven fact. So this is an article I found on reformjudaism.org. And essentially it's an interview with Richard Elliott Friedman. And on the left it describes what his background is. And I'll leave this slide up for a little bit, and you can even pause the video here if you want to see more about this. But he mentioned something very interesting in this interview. He's responding to an interview they did with another group of researchers. And those researchers were claiming that there's no evidence for, if you will, the Exodus ever taking place. But what he mentions is something interesting. He says in the very beginning, here in the highlighted area, after reading those articles, your readers may have concluded that scholarship shows that the Exodus is fictional, when in fact, that is not so. There is archaeological evidence and especially textual evidence for the Exodus. And he later goes on and says, I respect Professor Sperling and Rabbi Wolf, the people they had interviewed earlier who said that there was no evidence for it. They were understandably following the claims of some of our archaeologists. Those archaeologists' claims that the Exodus never happened are not based on evidence, but largely on its absence. They assert that we've combed the Sinai and not found any evidence of a mass of millions of people whom the Bible says were there for 40 years. That assertion is just not true. There have not been major excavations of the Sinai, and we have most certainly not combed it. Now, he goes into a little bit interesting things later on, which I won't include here, and you can read the rest of the article. I'll try to link it below. But he says that, for example, during one of the wars of Israel, I think he mentions the Six-Day War, if I remember correctly, he says that there was a tank or the Sinai, one of the conflicts in the Sinai, and he says that there was basically a jeep that had been covered in sand, and they found it under a huge amount of sand after only 40 years. And it was like amazing to the people who mentioned it. So that's one side of this other side of the evidence. I mean, again, a person could say, well, I don't agree with him either. And again, most people would never give a full reason why. Like they haven't gone to research to what he's saying themselves. So there's another side of it, for example, that there's a guy who did research, who, for example, did a book and also a documentary called The Riddle of the Exodus. Now, there are people who immediately look at that and say, I disregard that because you can't say that this, anything happened. And that's one of the things I've noticed, that there are people who say, well, you can't say that it did happen. Just because I say you can't say it. It isn't because I have evidence that proves it 100% that it can't. But this guy, for example, I've read his book, and even if you were to argue with his information, he still presents a different side of the story. So again, that means that the other side hasn't been proven. If someone can pull out something that, is historical, it's able to be written in a concise form and be able to be explained. So you can look at this video. It's on YouTube, for example, and you can see for yourself. There's a lot of information in it that, comes from his trip to Egypt and also Egyptian sources about it. And there are a number of rabbis who speak with him about, the Torah-based perspective on it. Now, the next one at the below is Graham Hancock. Now, immediately, in some places, when you mention Graham Hancock, immediately laugh. But again, he's a researcher. Just because you don't agree with his perspective doesn't mean he doesn't have a validity to what he's saying. And again, you have to take all positions. So there are some people who, for example, hear his name and simply disregard it without even going through with the information. And again, I don't have to accept every little thing he says like anyone else. But again, it's something that you have to know both sides of the story and can't just, brush it off. The other side of it is that there's a couple of videos by Rab Zamir Cohen, for example, where he, goes through and kind of, goes through different Jewish sources as well as Egyptian sources concerning the Yetziat Mitzrayim or the Exodus. Now, a person can say, well, I don't agree with him either. Well, then, you can say, okay, well, Rav Amnom Yitzhaq has this interesting debate that goes on with a young man who also was saying that there's no evidence for, things in the Tanakh. And Rabbi Amnon Yitzhaq explains to him about the Yetziat Mitzrayim that's mentioned in the Papyrus. Now a person can say, well, I don't agree with that either. And you guys are just making up, your own ideas about it. Well, again, it's a papyrus that describes things that sound just like the 10 plagues, or people call it in Hebrew it's called the Esar Makot, that happened in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Now, again, it's written from a perspective, this papyrus that we're talking about is mentioned from the perspective of someone who's Egyptian, who wouldn't have known everything that was happening. But for example, the papyrus mentions things like the rivers turning to blood, the Nile being blood, people trying to drink it anyway. It mentions things, for example, like, wild animals going across the land. It mentions things like a group of evil people leaving with the wealth of Egypt. And it also mentions like pillars of fire and things like that, leaving these people. So again, a person can debate these things out, but it still exists as the other side. So that means that the position that there was no Yetzirah Mitzrayim isn't a proven fact. It just means that there's people who believe that it happened, people believe it didn't happen. And then the last thing I would list here is that there's a good book by Rav Zamir Cohen that he deals with all these archaeological issues. Now, this is the version I have. I have it in Hebrew. I don't read English stuff of this anymore, but he has an English version on his website. If you look up, I think Rabbi Zamir Cohen, in like Tanakh archaeology, I think it is in English. There's an English version of it. I can't forget. Keep forgetting what it's called in English, but again, it's not something I read, but it can be found. And he goes through it, and you can read it, and you can choose to disagree with it, but you can't claim that there's no position on the other side that is well thought out and put together, and you can just simply say, I don't agree with it for these reasons. Also of note is the fact that it's very clear to people who've actually studied any form of Egyptology, for example. And this is from the Canadian Museum of History. This isn't just me making this up. This isn't just some, wacko source, for example. It mentions for the following: ancient Egypt, a land of mysteries. No other civilization has so captured the imagination of scholars and lay people alike. Mystery surrounds its origins, its religions, and its monuments, architecture, colossal temples, pyramids, and the enormous Sphinx. The Egyptian pyramids are the most famous of all the ancient monuments, the only remaining wonder of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Now, this brings up the question, why would people say, just as this other source says, that there are unsolved mysteries in ancient Egypt? Well, the easy fact of it is because the ancient Egyptians don't exist anymore and haven't existed for thousands of years. So when you look through and say, okay, well, this is what they wrote about something, well, you don't have everybody's opinion on it. You only have whoever was able to like carve something into a wall or write a papyrus. Often you don't have the average person's opinion. And the other issue is that you don't have a continuous culture that understands the information there. And even if you look up concerning the pronunciation of ancient Egyptian, it's not very clear 100% if the pronunciation that is used today is 100% accurate, number one. It's also not always clear if they have the correct meaning, because, for example, in Hebrew, there's a word that is spelled, like, for example, a certain way, and it can either be pronounced halav or halav. If it's halav, it's a type of fat. With halav, it's milk. So they're spelled exactly the same way because Hebrew usually uses consonants, and ancient Hebrew only had consonants in a written form. So if you, for example, looked at it in ancient Hebrew, you could either have it could be either way. And there's some situations where the word it could be either word unless you understand what's being talked about. You'd have to have an oral Torah to understand that it means milk in this situation, and in this situation it means the fat around a certain type of organs internally. So in summary, if we're going to look at this issue, and this is one of the things I felt I had to make this video because of the fact that someone had written some things about me and was taking the things that I wrote in the wrong direction, and I think kind of on purpose to make a certain point. But let's get back to the initial thing that I presented. So this, I think, brings up something very interesting. It's a quote that I use quite often from Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I hate if I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sorry for that. But he says something very interesting about like science and scientists. He says, but you can't be a scientist if you're uncomfortable with ignorance, because scientists live on the boundary, at the boundary between what is known and unknown in the cosmos. This is very different from the way journals portray us. So many articles begin, scientists now have to go back to the drawing board. It's as though we're sitting in our offices, feet up on our desk, masters of the universe, and suddenly say, oops, somebody discovered something. No, we're always at the drawing board. If you're not at the drawing board, you're not making discoveries. You're not a scientist, you're something else. The public, on the other hand, seems to demand conclusive explanations as they leap without hesitation from statements of abject ignorance to statements of absolute certainty. This is a very beautiful statement because it's the same thing when it comes to historical research. You're always at the drawing board. There is no such thing as like something happened 3,000, 4,000 years ago. We've got it all figured out. No, there's constantly discoveries being made. In fact, if you look at Egyptian history, like recent Egyptian history, they're still discovering stuff that they didn't know existed from several thousand years ago. They're discovering mummies that weren't known, and the other thing is you have people for the last several thousand years who've stolen a lot of stuff from, Egypt, who've hoarded things, so there are situations where people find something on the other side of the world because of the fact that someone took it, maybe hundreds of years ago, decades ago, sold to someone else, and then it got to someone who said, okay, well, I'm going to finally make this, make people aware that this thing exists. This is a perfect explanation. And even in terms of Torath Mosheh, constantly at the drawing board, and this is the thing that, I think that the person who's using this doesn't quite understand because again, the issue is simple. Hashem did not give the Torah to fool people, to make people think that, okay, well, here's the reality that's different. You didn't know it. I'm fooled you. Now you're going to go burn in some burning hot place. That's not at all what the Torah is given. In fact, the Torah was given to the Jewish people. It wasn't given to the entire world to have. So if anything, if, for a Jew, the Torah was not given to us to contradict things that are seen and proven to be true. Not what someone thinks to be true, proven. Proven means that there is no other side. It's 100% known that this is the case. When, for example, if I get into a car accident, there's no information that says, there's no way of saying, oh, well, this isn't really an accident. Someone says, hey, your car, hit my car and broke my leg. The evidence will show what happened. Now it could show that the person put their brakes on too early. It could show that I was driving too close. But still, the fact that there's an accident there, I can't deny that and say, well, there's no proof of that. No. Now, again, what led up to the events, there's a whole different story. And it's the same thing with, proven facts. Again, proven to be true means that there is no other side. It means that there is no debate about what happened. Everybody agrees that this is what happened. All the evidence shows that this is what happened. And there's nothing to the contrary. So this is what I mean when I use this statement. The Torah is not, cannot contradict what is seen to be proven to be true. Because again, this idea that, the creator of all things gave information to fool people is actually something you find in the writings of Paul in the New Testament, because he, for example, mentions that the whole Trinity thing is, a type of mystery. When you look in the Hebrew text, you find nothing that defines such a thing, as what he said, as well as the idea that he's talking about. So again, then you'd have to assume, okay, well, the creator gave the Torah to fool the Jewish people, and then later say, well, the Torah wasn't important. I only tested you to make sure that, to show you that you didn't need it. Well, why'd you give it to us in the first place then? If you're trying to, fool us, what's the point of that? That doesn't go anywhere. And that's what this is getting at, that, there's no reason to think that, okay, the Torah says that this person existed or this event happened, but, there's not going to be any evidence at all for a Jew to be able to prove it and say that, okay, well, I'm going to accept certain facts about it. I mean, the Torah is constantly saying, prove these things to be true or, take on facts. And you saw that the information I mentioned earlier deals with that also. So again, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.